I'm rattling cages today, and poor Anne, she knows me well because I'm rattling it her way about some of the limitations we find for our deaf children in early childhood settings. Not a segregated setting like Aurora, where you have the expertise that is probably supporting the children who need segregated settings. I'm talking about children out there who need funding, and whether we're recognising their needs. Because as you probably know, unless you see a cochlear implant or a hearing aid, deafness really is an invisible disability, and in our field we are discouraged from using the word disability, so we've got all sorts of other cultural reasons why we speak of deafness as a difference in, sometimes even in culture and certainly in language. So this is us at Aurora. We have three main programs. I'm representing the early intervention program. And probably a bit like many of you said today, we do straddle the early intervention and early childhood sector. So I do a lot of my work in kindergartens, childcare centres, homes, on kitchen floors, wherever the child is. So today we'll do it as briefly as possible. Some of these issues here, I've mentioned funding, but just the facts about prelingual deafness and some of those issues I won't go into too much. But I guess I'd like to actually focus on some of the issues with the national and state frameworks, the early childhood frameworks, which really present beautifully, but when you actually look at them in terms of this particular child with this particular disability, and in this case deafness, sometimes they're not as generous as they might sound. Okay, I'm just going to flick through these because you'll be able to read them later, but the incidence of deafness hasn't changed over decades and decades. It's usually about 1 in 1,000. So we're still getting, like everyone seems to be getting, lots of kids. It's not decreasing. The genetic information isn't changing the incidence of deafness. It's just that we're diagnosing more. We're certainly doing it from birth now, hopefully. In Victoria, we were the slowest of all states in the country to put on newborn screening, but hopefully we're getting the diagnoses at a couple of months of age now. Okay, so here are some of the facts and figures. A lot of people don't realise that most of the deaf children in the world, this is not just Australia, are born to hearing parents. So only about 3% of children in the world who are deaf will have 2 deaf parents. About 5% will have 1 deaf parent and 1 hearing parent. So we're dealing with, in our job, we're dealing with parents who have usually never struck any issues to do with deafness. They've never even thought about having a deaf child, let alone having to learn how to communicate and advocate for their child. And what we're finding more and more since, some of us have been around for hundreds of years, but certainly when I started in the field a long, long time ago, we used to say about 10% of children had additional needs, and then we'd say about 20%. And now in most of the literature now it's about 40, and sometimes we see 50%, depending on the cohort of kids you're looking at. But it's more than likely, or as likely, that you're going to get what we used to call a straight deaf child, which was a child with no additional needs. Some of the research I'm doing at the moment, it's interesting just to see the emerging additional needs. You think you've got a child with nothing else, and then as the months and years go by, other things emerge, and we've got to be aware of them. And a whole host of, as you would all know, they'd be very similar to what you're dealing with. And of course this is just preaching to the converted, I'm sure. Our main concern in our field really is the access to language. We often think that a child in a wheelchair, or with mobility constraints, even certainly vision constraints, can still acquire language absolutely normally if they are hearing and if they have access to a language. Just one will do. We don't care how many, but just one accessible language, and that's our problem in our field, is that many of our children don't have access to that language. Okay, and we do know, and it really is coming out loud and clear now, that there is a lot of mental health issues in our field. Some of my colleagues who are working as counsellors now are seeing the teenagers and young adolescents and adults coming with really significant mental health problems, and they really are based on their childhood and not having access to language, and even that whole theory of mind where you're understanding the mental state of another. You need language for that. You cannot do that. My dog Brady has no idea why I'm furious with him because he's just eaten another tennis racket or whatever. He has no theory of mind, and unfortunately what we say is some of our deaf kids are actually lower than children with Down syndrome and around about the autism level as far as theory of mind if they don't acquire language. So, the red flag's there. So, in terms of challenges of accessing programs, early childhood programs, there's some of the things we're dealing with. Very invisible, absolutely. You don't see that until you start getting the problems, and we don't want to cure, we want to prevent. So we want to know about this. So all of you out there, if you're working in programs where you know a child with a hearing loss is coming into your program, think about some of these as I go through them. Now, with all the technology in the world, and there's some brilliant developments, certainly since some of us started in the game where the kids still had body aids with cords that they'd cut because they hated wearing them, great big button moulds, and some people nodding up the back there, great big clumbering things, boys wearing things that look like bras because that's where you put the equipment. Nowadays it's little tiny behind the ear aids, fabulous, cochlear implants, FM units, but it still hasn't taken away the fundamental problem of being deaf, in that it does not correct. Unlike glasses, and I've got my contacts in so I can see people now, it's corrected my vision. I can see perfectly well now. Thank you. If I'm deaf and I have certainly a severe profound loss where there's a lot of distortion, those hearing aids, even cochlear implant, aren't going to clear that distortion away. So these are some of the issues we have with children in early childhood settings where there's lots of lovely stuff going on, but there's auditory noise and visual noise. There's all sorts of things that children have to use their figure ground discrimination for. So that in itself can be a challenge. Okay, so you may or may not know this. There's still the age-old problem in our field of the delay. By the time many children get to the end of school, either secondary or primary school, there is a significant delay. Getting better with a lot of our kids with cochlear implants. There's no doubt about that, but there's still some of the research now coming out is showing that tracking pretty well until middle of primary school, and then even with cochlear implants having been diagnosed at birth, there still seems to be that gap occurring, particularly in literacy. And so these are some of the things that are so important in our early childhood programs. That's the bedrock of literacy, the bedrock of relationships, of attachment, all these really important developments. And if we're missing all of this and saying, look, you've got your devices on, Bob's your uncle, we don't have to worry, then that's what's happened over the years. We've just said, look, you're okay. But in fact, a lot of these kids aren't if we aren't aware of it. So some of these funding issues that we need to, when we're writing, some of us who are trying to help write KISS applications and we don't call it this, ISPS, what's the new one in childcare centres? So it's got 4 letters now anyway. It's difficult. We have to try and use language that is addressing, how many, 10 minutes, okay, addressing some of these issues that aren't, the indicators aren't there for us. So I'll talk to you, Anne, later about this. Okay, and just know that if you say, well, the kid's going to lip read, at best 40%, purple lips, they were red on my thing. The colours, they were red lips. Only about 40% of what I say is visible on my lips if all you're doing is lip reading. Okay, so I'm going to flick through this. I think I've probably belaboured the point that actually there's a risk for language acquisition. We also want to know with our bilingual kids that they have made a preference for the language that is best suited to their needs, so that when they're going into school and they're saying, well, you've got one language, do we still include that other language? In good bilingual practice, we should be. So the funding models don't support that either. So these are the challenges that a lot of our deaf kids face. Okay, now I won't go through this. You'll see this on the slides. This is just reminding us that actually even a mild hearing loss is a really significant educational challenge for children. That's why they're fitted with hearing aids at 30 decibels. So I won't even go through that. Mild, moderate, 75% of the speech signal can be missed with just a moderate loss. That's huge, as opposed to, severe. Now, most of the kids are getting implants, but it's not automatic. I'm still working with a lot of kids who are not processing any language through their cochlear implants for whatever reason. So if you see a child coming onto your service with devices, don't just assume that they are actually understanding. They may be hearing everything you say, but maybe not understanding. You've got to actually look for that. Okay. All right, so we're just talking about... this is the bit I just wanted to talk. How many have I got? 5 minutes?
No, a bit more.
Okay, good. We've looked at the disability standards. There was a review just a year or so ago that I put a submission in for on behalf of teachers of the deaf, because we have a problem with the terminology. On the same basis, reasonable adjustments. What does that really mean? In the Disability Act, it really isn't very helpful for our deaf kids because, again, some of these issues, they're just not understood at the top level there. And what does participation mean for our deaf kids? They look like they're involved, they look like they're engaged, but what are they learning? How are we assessing that? And what supports are we putting in place in terms of our funding that is actually going to allow that child to learn to the best of their ability? Good heavens, I don't know what happened there. That's supposed to be a picture. Oh, no, it's...
the internet, it might not.
Yes, yeah, but it's stuck now, so... Whoop. It's all right. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Here we go. Here's some research. So even with all the training we've got and all the technology and all of the wonderful advancements, we still are finding that we've got social barriers. We've got a lot of kids who find social relationships very difficult. This isn't from Aurora. This is just research that's out there. These are just warning signs for you. Lower social status, more loneliness. They're really important things for our kids. Low speech intelligibility. I find that a lot with our little ones. Kids who just are not confident enough because they think, oh, what if they laugh at me again? I can't take it. So again, social peers, inadequate theory of mind. We've talked about that. These are the hidden constraints that come with deafness that very often, when you look at the TV reports about the cochlear implant, apparently that all goes away once the surgeon gets in the cochlear, the array of electrodes. It actually doesn't, but that's what we're led to believe. We have to keep thinking about these issues. Okay, so I'm just going to look at social skills. I want to just talk about the frameworks. So we've got the early years learning framework on a national level, and I know Anne and Sue were talking about the belonging, becoming, and being. Okay, that all sounds terrific. And we've got our Victorian version, and that sounds terrific. And along with these, we've got the 8 practice principles that are fantastic as well when you read them. And at Aurora, I know we've done a lot of work in looking at how this relates to our own field. But in doing so, we've actually uncovered some of the limitations to these 8 practice principles because if we look at this one, for instance, the numbers 1 and 2, so family-centred practice, what happens if these kids can't? We're saying here's a given. They benefit from consistent responsive caregiving. They need to feel secure. But you can have 2 years of attachment pretty well, your first 2 years of life without language. But once you've hit about that 2-year stage, language has to be present. You're not going to continue your journey if you can't communicate with your caregivers. Number 3, high expectations. We always say we have huge expectations for our children, but really in practice is this happening? Because, okay, what about this one? How many programs I've gone into, and it's only just recently, where the expectation for the deaf child is so low it's ridiculous. Well, I can see devices on, I know they're working, but he's deaf, he won't understand. I went into a setting not long ago and the deaf child with bilateral implants was sitting on a couch over there. All the children were here with the teacher. She was giving them a razz about something they'd all done wrong. And I said, why is she over there? Oh, she wouldn't understand. I nearly sobbed. And I actually went and I signed to her. Now she has some Auslan, not enough because no one's signing to her, but she has no intelligible speech even though she has implants. So what did that do to her self-esteem? Anyway, and I wonder what her mental health is going to be like when she's older. I must say, I really wonder. Okay, and so equity and diversity, let's see what we've got here. Auslan may be the child's first language. So we're saying we're going to recognise biculturalism and bilingualism and all the rest, but in terms of our deaf kids, it's very rarely mentioned that also includes Auslan and English or Auslan and first home language. It's usually Torres Strait Islander or multicultural issues. So think about that too. If you have a bilingual deaf child, are you respecting both languages? Are you respecting the preferred language of the child? And our funding models don't, I mean, it's all very different from mainstream, so I'm highlighting this, so for those of you who want to be involved in writing these submissions, you can use these clever words. Professionals taking responsibility for removing barriers. That's what I've just said. Are we aware of the barriers? Do we know what we have to remove to allow these children to have full access to their early childhood program? And equity and equality is another big one. You know, we're talking about cultural value, but what's the dominant culture's attitude to deafness? I'm working with a Muslim family at the moment. You don't mention the word deaf. Deaf means defect. Deaf means all the other negative connotations you can imagine. So, and I'm actually not allowed sign. The mother actually uses sign language, but the father is from a culture where you don't do that because you look different, and therefore people will know my child has a defect. So that cultural attitude, I respect it. That's from his culture. But what does that do to allowing us to move forward with that particular child? And here's just another one, which is respectful relationships. We often talk about getting down and talking to the children about, you know, how they're feeling and what impact did that event have on you, and how many of our deaf kids actually can't talk about that. So what are we doing? You know, in the funding model, do we say, okay, this child looks like they're participating really well, but even for something like that, at Aurora in the school-based program, you would have an extra pair of hands. You'd have someone in that program who would be highlighting that, getting down and unpacking whatever happened, and if you need visuals, if you need Auslan, if you need whatever, take a video of what happened, look at it again. So you can't do that if you're the teacher and you've got one assistant in a kindergarten program. Okay, and one more example, extended interactions. Again, it's to do with communication, maybe the confidence, no matter which modality the child is using, it can be very, very difficult. So we've got the practice principles, as I say, which I'm just unhooked, have I? Don't worry, I'll just talk. Which look fantastic on paper, but I guess what we need to know is what relevance do they have for our deaf kids? I'm going on and on, okay. And so there's more and more, you'll see them. So the funding models, I've talked about this. These three we find very difficult at times. And I know Anne knows because I'm always harping onto her about it. Yeah. No, you didn't create them. And I guess
we have to live with them.
We do, and I guess my comment is I'm not going to shy away from it. I personally find them very challenging myself to, and I know one of my dear colleagues in the audience, and we've had a discussion today about how do we find, without lying our heads off, how do we find the right way to describe the challenges this deaf child is going to have when we know there will be no intelligible communication, and therefore the relationships, the quality of learning is going to be severely compromised. What indicator there are we going to use to advocate for this child? And yeah, so, oh sorry, what was that there? That's the one. So yeah, I'll leave that with you. And esteemed Timur again, you know, that the traditional notions of inclusion, it's the environments, and what is that environment actually providing? It might look wonderful and all the other kids are really happy, and sometimes our deaf kids look so happy, but in fact just look below the surface and ask yourself some of these questions. And if you don't know the questions to ask, just ring us. But we do want you all to be thinking more about it, because you're the ones out there who are going to be making the difference. Because as Tim would say, 3% of the time most of these children is spent with ECIA specialised people. Okay, thank you very much. How did I do there? Better than us.